Today on Old School Rules, we take a look at the very first Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer. This is our channel, Old School Rules, a place for everyone that loves classic RPGs and anyone who'd like to learn more about them. On today's episode, we continue our look at the products of Judges Guild, and this is called the First Fantasy Campaign, and is the details from Dave Arneson's original Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Hope you enjoyed the video. Today on Old School Rules, we're taking a look at one of my favorite products from Judges Guild. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, Dave Arneson had started call it fantasy role-playing campaign before Dungeons & Dragons was even written. And after D&D came out, Judges Guild released some of his notes in a product they called the First Fantasy Campaign. And that's what we're taking a look at today on Old School Rules. Here's our cover. This is the original cover. We'll talk in a minute about the different editions of this that came out in case you're a collector and you want to know a little bit more about that. Here's the artwork. Sort of just like I always think of it like mountain or caverns setting, and then they've got this godlike drawing here in the middle. Sort of reminds me of Mercury. He's zapping some fire. He's got flames coming out of his little sandaled feet. Not really sure why they picked that design. It never quite made sense to me, but it is the cover of this product. And you'll see here, Judges Guild, 88-page book and 2 campaign maps revealing the history and details of the original fantasy role-playing game. Visit the Dread Egg of Coot, Loch Goodman, and the underworld below Blackmoor Castle. So you probably know the original supplements to the Woodgrain box. There was one called Greyhawk, and then the second one here was called Blackmoor. And those names mostly were, I think, used to honor those original campaigns from the creators, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. This supplement in particular does not contain a lot of information about the Blackmoor campaign. I think Dave shared some notes, but the rules here are a compilation of different things that different people created who were connected to TSR in the early days. And you don't really get a lot of information about his campaign, which is why Judges Guild was able to produce this product, which was specifically information about Dave's original fantasy campaign. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. Now, this is Judges Guild product. 1977 is when the first edition gets produced, and we'll talk about that in a second. Here's my first edition of this, and it's done by Dave Arneson. It says right there in the bottom, $7.95. Here's a later printing that I have, and we'll talk about the differences you can see. But you got that booklet, whatever size it happened to be, and then you got these campaign maps. And unlike most of the maps Judges Guild, if you've been watching those videos that came out, these were just single-sided. This is the player's map, does not have a lot of information on it. And then there would be a judge's map, which has, a lot more detail about the relevant areas, all sort of filled in, whereas the players have to do that over time by exploration. Here's our first edition cover. Came with the 2 maps. That's it. That was the product you would get for $7.95. And again, this was something you would buy outside of the regular subscription service. You'll see here, one of the ways you can tell it's the first print, the price is centered up right in the middle. And then if you go to the back page, which has the booty list, you'll see the highest numbered thing on here is number 35, which is 3 Monstrous Statistics compendium sheets, right? And so that's one of the ways you know by looking at that highest numbered thing, how late in the production cycle these things came along. Here's the second print. You'll see the price, it's really hard to see, is now down here on the bottom right side. And then if you come back here and look at the more fine products from, right, they've changed the name of that, and the highest numbered thing on there now is 380, which is Duck Pond. That's how you can tell you've got a second print. Okay, table of contents. Several things are in here, and I'm going to do an overview video today, and then this is so interesting, I think, to people who really are into the early days of the hobby. I'm going to do a few follow-on videos and really dive deep and give you a lot of specific information from each of these sections. This is sort of how Dave broke it out. Information about the campaign, some map notes, more infamous characters, information on the kingdom and castles, into the great outdoors, which was some information about exploring around that area, the dungeons, which are particularly famous. Everyone sort of knows, right, that story. The campaign players came over one night. Dave has got this castle set up. Each of the players is going to be a particular character, and they're going to go into the castle and then go under it into the dungeons, right? The very first dungeon fantasy campaign as far as we know, and certainly the one that's connected to Dungeons and Dragons. And then again, some specific information about he really was into magic swords. He's got some gypsy sayings, the original magic system, some other items of interest. Then Svensson's Freehold, which is a castle. That's one of his players. Richard Snyder's additions to the rules, and then the information about Loch Goodman. Here's the inside cover or the copyright page for the first edition. You see here is the later printing, right? And you can obviously see some differences into how that's set up. Here's our first inside page. Again, copyright 77, some notes. He says the fire elemental, I guess he's calling that person I thought was a sort of Greek god, is a fire elemental. It's drawn by Pixie Bledsaw. Other illustrations inside of here are credited to Dave Arneson. Some of the graphics belong to Bob Bledsoe and Bill Owen. Of course, that's Judges Guild. And typing of this document, Norma Bledsoe, who was, again, very small shop there at the very beginning days of this. Here you'll see the table of contents, two different pages based on whether you have the first printing or a later printing. But basically, it's all the same information, although the page count gets smaller in the later printings. There's also some differences in the art, and I'll show that to you a little later on. Okay, so here, I'm going to read this. I think it's interesting stuff. So first we've got a foreword by Bob Bledsoe and an introduction by Dave Arneson. So here's Bob's foreword. It has been especially satisfying to work with one of the giants of the hobby, Dave Arneson, originator of the dungeon adventure concept. Much of the initial impetus of fantasy role-playing as it exists today is due to the dedication and work of his imagination and creative personality. And I think a lot of people who have tried to dig into that history see it that way as well. Dave was really the one. He was a creative idea guy. He was not someone who could create organized rules and sort of create a game that you could hand to somebody else that they could buy and try and play the same thing. And I think that's, from what I hear, that's a fair comment on the creation of D&D as well. Gary was really a rules guy. He had, right or wrong, in terms of whether you liked his rules, and some people liked to, obviously homebrew some of the rules. Gary was a person who liked to sit down and think through a system that you could then sell and share with other people. And of course, he was the one who was trying to make this into a business. Dave has attempted to show the development and growth of his campaign as it was originally conceived. I'm sure he was tempted to update the work to match the pace of new trends, but he presents an unpolished gem while preserving the feel and wonder of its unveiling, much to our benefit as fantasy game judges. For this and for the faith he has shown in Judges Guild as publishers, Dave has my hearty gratitude. This work will answer many of the questions the entire hobby has been clamoring for since fantasy role-playing began its fervor in the Midwest and spread across the nation and then across the world. It is not necessarily what you would expect. Within these pages are many new and previously unseen ideas ripe for use in your fantasy world. I'm sure you will enjoy it as much as I did, and you can bet your magic sword that more than nostalgia is contained herein. May your players experience the same gusto and pleasure of the first fantasy campaign. So, my own personal editorial, I think this is particularly interesting as a historical document. It is, I think, probably a fairly good insight into the notes cobbled together in memories of Dave at a relatively early time about his campaign. He mentions in here that some of his notes are lost, so the very, very first stuff is not necessarily ever going to exist again. But this is really interesting, and it's different. And I think one of the things that Dave was trying to do was share with people his view of what D&D, or vision for what D&D would look like as a game. I think one of the things that this product, again, my editorial, one of the things this product exposes if you sit and read it is this is not really a game, right? I couldn't read this and figure out how to play D&D from it. If you understand, and that was Gary's vision, right? How to create this sort of skeleton or framework or rules that then people could play. I think as someone who's played D&D a lot and understands it and has read the original rules and so forth, you can read this and make more sense of it and figure out how to utilize it or what's interesting about it. But again, very much an insight into what Dave was contributing, which was just a lot of energy and ideas and creativity around this idea of playing a fantasy campaign and doing role playing and have people have characters that would get better over time and so forth. Okay, so here's Dave's own introduction. From the first excursions into the dark depths of Blackmoor Castle's dungeon, it became apparent that these first hardy bands of adventurers would soon seek out new worlds to pillage. From the castle itself, the small town of Blackmoor grew. Then the surrounding countryside became filled with new holes to explore, and beyond that, talk was already spreading about visiting the Egg of Coot. There's some apocrypha that the Egg of Coot, who's a bad guy, is at this point his view is sort of like Gary, like EGG. I don't know if that's true. I don't know enough about the history to know for certain whether the Egg of Coot predates or postdates Dave's sort of falling out with Gary. But in any event, that's just, I shared that piece of little apocrypha for what it's worth. Each of these steps entailed a great deal of work upon a naive referee who felt that there was already more than enough trouble available to satisfy a band of adventurers, a phrase no doubt heard rather frequently since in other areas. In general, a fairly loose procedure was set up for the establishment of each of these new areas, because remember, these guys wanted to set up like their own little baronies, right, that they would control, because this all sprung from the Great Kingdom, which was Gary's concept for the Castle and Crusade Society. And each person, like on that map, was more of a wargaming mentality, and you would have a different area as opposed to like Europe, right, in the real world. You would have a different area, and then you could do battles, and that was kind of the idea. And so these players had that framework, right? So that was something they were interested in. At the height of my participation as chief co-creator, there were 6 dungeons and over 100 detailed player characters to be kept track of at any one time, which was another thing here, that you'd have lots and lots of players, and they wouldn't always necessarily all sit down at the table together. And again, he says there was an emphasis on other people also creating their own dungeons, so that it wasn't only just Dave. Okay. Each area that we would create had to mesh with other areas around it, insofar as setting up various monsters, etc., was concerned. It was also apparent from previously running things like he had a conventional Napoleonic war game, that we needed an overall background to be constructed to get the framework from which players could work. Thus, the overall concept of the evil Egg of Coot and the Great Kingdom was born. Those entities could prove to be the source of great events outside the actual campaign, a source of new recruits, new monsters, gift stimulus, quests, adventures, etc. So there was something to do more than just looting a dungeon. Also, with such powerful and potentially aggressive neighbors, the locals decided that at least some taxes should be collected to provide for defense. This was a good plan, but which failed to take into account the drain placed on local manpower by repeated sorties into the dungeon. So it was with the Dungeon of Blackmoor. It began with only the basic monsters in chainmail and was only some 6 levels deep. 6 levels was chosen since it allowed random placement with a 6-sided die. No funny dice back then. John Peterson has an interesting discussion about the origin of polyhedral dice and so forth. But then again, this is contemporaneous. This is from 77. This is what Dave says, no funny dice at that point. So even in the dungeon, it became quickly apparent there was a need for a greater variety of monsters, more definitions, types of monsters, and a deeper dungeon. And there were now different types of dragons by size and other creatures like gargoyles being pulled from standard mythology. Armor class was determined by description of the creature, hide, scales, etc., and how impervious it would be in the accounts from mythology or wherever we got the ideas. Hit dice was determined pretty much on the same, based on the size of the creature physically in regard for mythical properties. Regular animals that were basically larger, for example, giant beetles, a standard textbook provided interesting facts about the critters. Then they were given hit dice proportionate to their size relative to other types of beetles or other types of monsters. Character motivation was solved by stating that you did not get experience points until the money had been spent on your area of interest, so fighters on combat or weapons, magic users on new spells or potions, etc. This would lead to additional adventures as players would order special cargoes from off the board and have to go and guard them so that it would get back to where they lived, and then the player would get their experience points. More than one poor fellow found that his special motivators would literally run him ragged and get him killed before he actually got anything. Combat was simple at first and got progressively more complicated with the addition of hit locations. And you'll see that actually, that is one thing that does show up in the Blackmoor booklet, is a sort of specific hit location. That idea never really takes off in D&D, although it becomes a popular concept in many later role-playing games. The players rolled for characteristics. The number of hits a body could take was from 0 to 100. As the player progressed, he did not receive additional hit points, but rather became harder to hit. Again, that's a concept you'll see, I'll say, in the literature, debated. This idea, for example, people talk about, you've seen in my fanzine videos if you watch those, when people fall, right? A person at 10th level shouldn't be able to fall 100 or 200 feet and survive. But because you get more hit points, maybe you can. So again, here, you don't get more hit points, you just become harder to hit. And it's interesting, someone smarter than me and more into this than me could probably have a really interesting discussion about the difference in concept and sort of whether that's better, what would mean for D&D if you took that different approach, etc. All right, so all normal attacks carried out in the usual fashion, but the player received a saving throw against a hit that he or she received. And so although you might be hit several times during the round, in actuality you might not take any damage against your base hit points at all. Only fighters gained advantages in melee saving throws. Clerics and magicians, remember that's all you had, progressed in their own areas which might or might not satisfy their saving throw. And so it went. Hit locations so that even the mighty small could fall in a single arrow at the right place, although that would be very unlikely. Height differentiation so little guys could run around more and big ones could kill them more. But still, these were guidelines. Hit locations generally used for the bigger critters, and only on a man-to-man level were all options thrown in. This allowed play to progress quickly, even if the monsters suffered more from it. By the end of the 4th year of continuous play, Blackmoor covered hundreds of square miles, had a dozen castles, 3 separate referees, as my own involvement was decreasing due to other commitments. But by then it was more than able to run itself as a fantasy campaign and keep more than 100 people and a dozen referees as busy as they are today. Whether there will ever be the coordination of all the area dungeons in the future as they are way back in the good old days is unlikely, but already 20 to 30 people meet every 4th Saturday to do something Blackmoor or otherwise fantasy related. Who can tell? After all, the keynote is that anything is possible, just that some things are more likely than others. Dave Arneson. Again, it'll be a little bit longer video, even though, and again, I'm going to keep it high level once we get moving here. But I thought that was probably worth digging into as we start into this look at the original or first fantasy campaign. Okay, so the first section he has here is called the Blackmoor campaign, and he gives really some background. If I would say from a wargamer's perspective. Again, we had a single castle, but then we got all these other castles and became part of the Castle and Crusade Society's Great Kingdom, etc. And this really lists the forces, army, that you would find in the different locations around on his map. He has information in here on prices, again, thinking of this as wargaming, if you wanted to get more troops and different types of troops, the costs and types of castles you might decide to build. And a little bit of information in terms of spending on magic. And he also had in each location sort of maximum, some information about the type of forces you could have. Again, thinking of this as wargaming, and gave some minimums and maximums about what those would be in different locations. He has information for those who are, again, building up their kingdom, the different sort of, call them improvement projects, roads, bridges, and so forth that you might want to do. And he has rules for all of that in the Blackmoor campaign. And then we have some notes on his campaign. This is kind of short. He said, I had a small area in the center of the Great Kingdom in the IFW's Castle and Crusade Society. The basic campaign area reproduced on a large map sheet was originally drawn from some old Dutch maps, so it gives you a little bit of background about the maps that he had. And then at one point, as they got out a little further, he started using the outdoor survival map, which was in the original AD&D, they talked about if you wanted to do wilderness to get that outdoor survival map. It's just a generic map you could use for that purpose. The next section is on Blackmoor's infamous characters, and he goes through, again, and gives information about different people who were there, right? Personalities, his little bit of historical information. I'll give you the names here for those who are curious. Ran of Athu, Jin of Salak, Marfelt the Barbarian, the Duke of the Peaks, the Blue Rider, Mello and the Hobbits, the Great Svenny, that's one of the famous players in his campaign, the Bishop. So that's his little summary about some of the people. And again, he goes into great detail, and we'll do a follow-up video and take a closer look at that stuff. Now we're going to talk about Blackmoor itself. Population of 1,000 peasants, 100 soldiers, 4,300 square miles, more or less, of arable land, etc. And he goes through and explains, like you would in a campaign source book, right, a little bit about the area of Blackmoor. And here's the map of the town, which is kind of, if you read this older stuff, a little bit famous. Here's the Comeback Inn, which was the starting point, and it had this funny feature: when you leave, you come right back in the front door. So there was sort of like a little magic to it. And there is the famous Blackmoor Castle. And here is some really brief maps you could use of what his idea was of what the castle looked like. And as he says, at some point they decided they needed more, and so they were going to go into, as he calls it, the great outdoors. So he says, after the first year, the guys traveled around more and began to use the outdoor survival board. He says, not until the third year we actually moved into that. Third year of his campaign, checking his notes. We needed an encounter matrix and breakdown, descriptions of the critters that could be encountered, a price list for other things we wanted, and so on. So first we have a little chart here you can see on the first page, which is essentially a wandering monster chart of what you might find in the great outdoors, as it were. And then he has some different things you can look up with a little bit more detail there down below. So he goes, after he has his charts, he goes on to say, travel from one perilous adventure to another in a neighboring castle can result in a great deal of frustration for players, or at least confusion, as the road is always populated by evil characters or creatures. There is supposed to be, of course, some sort of civilization, and it must have some form of communication, if for no other reason than to be moving the treasure around from castle to castle. In his opinion, he says, with a little work, the outdoor adventures can be enjoyable, and in the format of an overall campaign, this leads to the pacification of certain areas after a time. In other words, your characters move out, take over areas, maybe kill all the sort of orcs, goblins, bad guys, dragons, whatever, that were in an area, and becomes a little bit more civilized, safer to travel, and maybe someone even sets up there and makes that their home kingdom. And so he explains his idea, which is obviously he used a hex grid system and divided it off, and he had a chart where he would go through and sort of fill in exactly what was in each area of a multi-mile hex. And he goes through his ideas, which really are designed for like a multi-year campaign where you could go in, take over certain areas or clear out certain areas. He rolls to determine the type of terrain you're in, might determine the type of creatures or bandits or people that you encounter. And then he also has some charts he wants to use for adventures over time, things that could happen. Maybe you get invaded, maybe there's a sort of supernatural event, etc. Then we have what is perhaps the most famous part of all of this, the Blackmoor Dungeon. If you remember, or if you've read any of the books, like John Peterson's book, etc., he talks about the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. The very first pre-D&D, right, adventure, the people in Dave's campaign group come over one night. He's going to be the referee, and instead of a sand table with sort of Napoleonic War, he's got this castle. Each of them is an adventurer, and they go into the dungeons underneath, which they just thought was totally different and great fun. And so he's got his description here, his sort of key for the dungeons, and this is something I'll go over in one of my specific videos. It'll probably start this, I'm going to guess, next week. And these are the real maps that he, according to him, that he had in his original dungeon. But he's lost the key or the room descriptions initially, and so now he's got updated keys that he's using. When he takes these around, people would ask him to play his dungeon in conventions and so forth. And it goes all the way down here through level 10. I think at some point he mentions there might have been 25 levels to his dungeon altogether. Only 10 are shown here in the First Fantasy campaign, plus this thing called Glendower. There's also some really cool art in here. This art is all on little tiny drawings on the maps, just sort of like, you know, off to the side or something like that. I'm pretty sure everything here is done by, I should get myself out of the way, is done by Dave Arneson. You may remember that Arneson did some of the illustrations in the original wood grain box set as well. Really cool. I like these. You know, you got a knight, a couple dragons, undead. There are some monsters of different types, a couple of which I'm not even sure what they are, but anyway, all in all, really cool stuff. I like it quite a bit. The next section here is Dave Arneson's description of how he created magic swords. Now, in his campaign, for some reason, he decided that really only swords were like extra enchanted. You might have a +1, you know, battle axe or something like that, but the swords, he went all out. They could have all kinds of special powers, intelligence, ego, skills, bonuses against different types of creatures, etc. I'm going to do a video about his, like, you know, look at these magic swords also. This is the matrix that explains how he would go about creating those. He had some interesting things he liked to do in his campaign. He calls them gypsy sayings and chance cards, and these are just things that would occur in the world, right? And so the chance cards are things you might draw to sort of get inspiration for a random type of event that would be occurring around you in the campaign world. And the gypsy sayings were sort of ways of giving warnings to characters about maybe something that was going to happen. Probably a bad thing, not necessarily, but gave the characters something to react to plan for, and maybe you could kind of see where that developed and let the players sort of help with the creativity of what was going to happen next. But anyway, just a way to give them some foreshadowing about what was coming down the pike. Some discussion about his original Blackmoor magic system, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It also has some magic items here as well. Some special interests. As he says, many characters wonder what they should spend their money on and what will get them in exchange, because obviously you don't want to just come up with piles of gold if you don't turn it into something. He's got a section here on Svensson's Freehold, and this is a character or player from his campaign, the great Svenny, who was quite popular, and he sort of draws out here his freehold or his castle, if you want to think of it like that. He's got some rules here from one of the other players called Richard Snyder, and he goes through and gives some details about some of his alternate rules. He had his own campaign, or not his own campaign, but his own DMing that he was doing there in the Blackmoor environs, and we'll probably talk about those, because I think that what were people doing in the early days always makes it kind of an interesting video. And then Loch Goodman, which was the destination for the party when the sort of evil hordes came in and kicked them out of where they lived. They ended up moving down into Loch Goodman, or he calls it Lake Gloomy. And so that's sort of one of the other areas that became important in his campaign. We've got some information here about dragons and other creatures that were sort of the rules they had for their campaign as well. And then finally in the back, you've got the last page of this is the booty list. And as I said, that changes from one edition to the other. This is from my first edition, and if you look here, you can see my third edition. It obviously looks a little bit different. It's now called More Fine Products. And so again, you look at that highest number in there, and that tells you where you are in the chronology of Judges Guild. All right, let's take a little bit more look at a couple of things. We're going to look at the maps, and we're going to talk about the additions. Here's the player's map, very sparse. We've got Blackmoor here in the center, and if we blow that up, you can see there's Blackmoor city that sort of sits right there on that inlet. Oh, I'm going to go back. Well, let's look here, the Judges version of this map, and we'll see some other areas in there that are of interest and maybe you've heard of if you study a little bit about the early days of D&D and his campaign. There's Blackmoor. And then we'll look at this blown up a little bit. This is the city of Moss, an elven forest, the sinking land. And that's, an interesting area, it sounds like, right? And then down at the bottom, we have Glendower. Here's the Duchy of the Peaks, and here's the famous one, right? Egg of Coot. He's like the big bad guy from the early days of the campaign. We get the Duchy of Ten, which I think plays an important part in the history of his campaign the Barrier Swamp, Lake Gloomy, or Loch Gloomin, as he called it, Boggy Bottom, the Nomads of the Ten, and the Temple of the Frog, which you will recall in the Blackmoor supplement, right, has a campaign adventure, the first TSR adventure put out in a way, and that is Dave Arneson's creation of the Temple of the Frog. There's Blackmoor, Tower of Boo, Bromwald, Region of the Mines, the Dragon Hills, and Valley of the Ancients. And in the Judges Guild campaign setting, what they did, remember they have the maps and all the things we've talked about in the different wilderness campaign settings for the Judges Guild, City State of the Invincible Overlord, etc. If I recall correctly, they position Dave Arneson's world, these maps, as sort of an attachment to the north side of the general Judges Guild campaign setting. So you could actually use this book a little bit, although Arneson doesn't give you a lot of detail like for this, like Judges Guild does for its. But these are maps drawn and looking a lot like the Judges Guild style that you could connect up there. And there's the Grand Kingdom. So the other thing I think that I really like, of course, in all their products is the artwork. I'm getting myself out of the way and show you one of the other interesting things here is that the artwork changes between the first print and the later printings. I think the artwork in these first printings is all Dave Arneson, and the later stuff, like a lot of it's Ken Simpson, and other people. So here, this is the battle in Blackmoor Bay. This is a historical event that happened in his campaign. As he says, the sea monsters won that one. Here's scenes from the run by the great Black Castle of the Orcs. Again, all these things drawn from things that happened during the play of their campaign, right? And just a couple different versions of that fight. Here's the drawing for the Comeback Inn, the main gate to Blackmoor Castle, an aerial battle over Blackmoor. This looks like another battle where they're attacking a fort. The doorway to one of the fouler areas of the dungeon. Very interesting little carving there around the door. Jewel with the Temple of the Id. And here's the approach to the city of Father Dragon, showing its size. The adventurers teleported themselves into the main throne room before the outside defending Balrogs could attack them, and were able to destroy the evil device by dropping a rock on it and freeing the dragons from their deep and unnatural slumber. Again, another cool campaign from the sounds of it. Battle with the Great Serpent of the River. One ship lost, clearly. An overview shot of the town where the Tomb of the Grey Dragon is located in Glendower. This was used at the local hobby shop several times for semi-outdoor town adventures. That's our look at the very first Dungeons & Dragons campaign. You might even say the first fantasy role-playing campaign, because a lot of it predates the publication of the official D&D rules. A lot of it based on just Dave's imagination, chainmail. But obviously that campaign continued long after the D&D rules were published. It's a great product. In my view, it's just full of interesting stuff. And if you really are interested in the history of D&D and what was Dave Arneson's campaign like, other than talking to the folks who were involved, which of course would be a fun thing to do, and there are various videos you can watch about that. This product I think gives you a really good sense of what his campaign was like, and also, to me, candidly, a really good sense of what Dave probably handed over to Gary Gygax or later Tim Kask at TSR and said, here are my ideas if you want to work this into the world of D&D. It's full of energy and creativity, but it needs a little help to show you how to take those ideas that are in Dave's mind and clearly worked so well at the table and turn those into things that someone else could pick up and read and share and use in their own home campaign. Great ideas, great product, lots of fun. I highly recommend it. Hope you guys are having a great day. Hope you're enjoying our channel, and I hope you're subscribed. If you have friends who might enjoy it, please send them our way. We'd like to add to our community as we head into 2026. Have a great rest of your day, and until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.